It was meant to be a simple private request, delivered quietly and obeyed without question. But when Camilla expected Princess Anne to fall into line, Anne did something almost unthinkable. She ignored her completely, setting off a chain reaction that left the palace struggling to contain the shock. Long before the royal family appeared before the waiting public, palace officials had already decided how the engagement was supposed to unfold. Every arrival had been timed, every greeting had been measured. Even the distance between senior family members had been carefully considered. In royal life, nothing was allowed to appear accidental, especially when position could communicate more powerfully than words. Then, shortly before the engagement, a senior member of Camilla's staff approached Anne with a private message. Camilla wanted the Princess Royal to alter her place in the official order. The change seemed small, almost harmless. Anne was being asked to move slightly farther back, giving Camilla a clearer and more commanding position beside Charles. But inside the monarchy, a single step can carry enormous meaning. Who enters first, who stands nearest the sovereign, and who is expected to move aside can reveal rank, loyalty, and influence. Camilla's request was not simply about convenience. It would quietly demonstrate that her authority reached beyond ceremony and into the private behavior of the family itself. Anne listened without showing irritation. She asked no questions. She offered no protest. Most importantly, she gave no promise that she would obey. Camilla's advisors interpreted that silence as acceptance. After all, who would openly reject a request from the Queen? They assumed Anne understood what was expected and would avoid creating tension around an engagement designed to project royal unity. Yet Anne's silence concealed a much deeper conflict. She respected protocol because she had spent her life serving the institution. But she also believed respect had to be earned through discipline, sacrifice, and years of duty. It could not simply be demanded through private instructions sent by an intermediary. And this was not the first time Anne had sensed the balance shifting. For months, she had watched arrangements change, access narrow, and ceremonial decisions increasingly revolve around strengthening Camilla's symbolic position. Anne had remained quiet, but quiet did not mean unaware. By the time the latest message arrived, she had already decided there were boundaries she would not allow anyone to move. When Anne entered the engagement, she walked directly to her original place. The reaction among palace staff was immediate. Camilla waited for her to adjust. An aide looked toward Anne, silently urging her to move. But Anne continued as though no alternative arrangement had ever been discussed. She did not glance at Camilla. She did not acknowledge the tension gathering around them. Her calmness made the refusal impossible to dismiss as confusion. To outsiders, nothing appeared wrong. To those who knew the plan, the message was unmistakable. Anne had not forgotten the request. She had rejected the authority behind it. In that moment, she did more than refuse to surrender her position. She challenged the growing assumption that Camilla could quietly rearrange the royal family around herself and expect everyone, even the Princess Royal, to obey. But to understand why Anne was willing to create such a dangerous moment, the palace had to look back at the growing tension that had been building long before that request was ever delivered. Anne's refusal did not begin that morning. For months, subtle changes had been unfolding behind palace walls, altered schedules, revised seating plans, carefully worded instructions, and a growing sense that Camilla was testing how far her new authority could reach before someone finally pushed back. For decades, Anne had built her position through work rather than performance. She rarely demanded attention, avoided unnecessary ceremony, and carried out royal duties with a discipline that made her one of the monarchy's most dependable figures. She did not need dramatic gestures to prove her loyalty. Her record spoke for itself. That was precisely why the changes around her became impossible to ignore. Camilla's influence worked differently. It was quieter, more carefully managed, and often delivered through advisors who understood the power of small details. Inside the palace, authority was rarely expressed through open commands. It appeared through precedents, invitations, access to the monarch, transport arrangements, borrowed jewels, seating plans, and the simple question of who was allowed to stand closest to Charles. Anne began noticing that arrangements once treated as fixed were being revised. Her schedule was adjusted without proper discussion. Roles at ceremonial events were narrowed. Invitations arrived later than expected. At first, each change seemed too minor to challenge. Together, however, they suggested something larger. Camilla's household was slowly reshaping the royal order around its own priorities. Other family members chose not to object. Some feared that resistance would be seen as an attack on Charles. Others were exhausted by years of public conflict and wanted to avoid another royal crisis. Compliance appeared easier than confrontation, but Anne saw a danger in that silence. When personal preferences were repeated often enough, they could begin to look like official rules. And once that happened, private influence could disguise itself as royal authority. There had already been warnings. Camilla's aides had allegedly attempted to redirect Anne's timetable and alter her role during earlier engagements. Anne tolerated those interventions when they could be explained as administration. She did not enjoy palace politics, but she understood that compromise was sometimes necessary. The latest request was different. Asking Anne to move behind Camilla was not about efficiency. It was a visible demonstration of submission. It reinforced Camilla's place above the Princess Royal while expecting Anne to participate in her own reduction. Anne did not dispute Camilla's title. She understood rank and respected the constitutional position beside the king. What she rejected was the private enforcement of obedience, the expectation that family members should surrender dignity whenever Camilla's advisors wanted to create a stronger image of control. That left Charles trapped in the middle. Camilla expected protection from her husband. Anne expected fairness from a brother she had defended through decades of scandal, pressure, and uncertainty. Courtiers understood how dangerous the conflict could become. If Anne resisted openly, others might begin questioning how much influence Camilla's household had already gained. And beneath the struggle over one position lay an even more explosive disagreement, one involving inheritance, royal ownership, and memories that Anne believed no new court had the right to rewrite. And when the palace examined what had triggered Camilla's determination to assert herself, the trail led away from ceremony and toward something far more sensitive, a collection of jewels Anne believed should never be controlled by personal ambition. Hidden behind the dispute over one public appearance was a far more explosive battle involving royal jewels, private inheritance, and a promise Anne believed had been made years earlier. What looked like defiance over protocol may actually have been Anne's warning that some boundaries could not be crossed. Away from the famous crown jewels known across the world, another collection carried a quieter but deeply personal power. These were historic brooches, necklaces, tiaras, and family pieces connected to generations of royal women. Some belonged to the monarchy itself. Others had passed privately from one sovereign to another. That blurred line created a dangerous question: who truly had the right to control them? Anne believed she already knew the answer. For years, she had understood that several pieces closely associated with Queen Elizabeth II were meant to remain available for important family and ceremonial occasions. They were not simply decorations. They carried memories, duty, and promises that reached beyond any one person. But after the late Queen's death, Camilla's household reportedly began reviewing access to the collection. The process was presented as practical, even necessary. As queen, Camilla's advisors believed she should have greater authority over which royal women could borrow certain pieces and when those jewels should appear. Then, one item became the center of the conflict. It was a historic piece with a powerful connection to Anne's mother, something the late queen had worn during significant moments of service. When Anne learned that it might be reserved for Camilla's exclusive use at a future engagement, her concern turned into anger. This was not jealousy. Anne had never built her place in the monarchy through glamour. Her authority came from decades of work, difficult duties, and loyalty under pressure. She did not need a tiara or brooch to prove who she was. What disturbed her was the principle behind the decision. In Anne's mind, private inheritance and royal property were being deliberately blurred to strengthen one person's image. A piece connected to the late queen was in danger of becoming a symbol of Camilla's growing control. Camilla's advisors saw the matter differently. To them, access to the jewels naturally followed her position beside the king. They believed the queen should shape the public identity of the new reign, and the collection was part of that authority. Anne believed such objects carried obligations. They belonged not only to the present court, but to the memories and sacrifices of those who had worn them before. Those meanings could not be rewritten simply because the balance of power had changed. A tense exchange reportedly followed between representatives of the two households. Neither side moved. Camilla's team defended her right to manage the collection. Anne's aides warned that restricting access would turn family inheritance into an instrument of control. Then came Camilla's request that Anne step behind her at the royal engagement. To Anne, the timing was impossible to ignore. It no longer felt like a simple adjustment. It felt like a demand for submission after she had challenged the handling of her mother's jewels. So Anne chose silence. Private arguments could be softened, denied, or selectively leaked. Conduct could not. She would answer in a way every palace insider would understand. By the time the royal engagement began, Anne was no longer deciding where to stand, she was deciding whether years of service could be pushed aside by a new court determined to demonstrate its authority. The signal was subtle enough for the public to miss, but inside the royal circle it was unmistakable. An aide approached. Camilla waited. Charles noticed. Yet Anne remained exactly where she was, turning a few silent seconds into one of the most uncomfortable displays of resistance the palace had witnessed. The family had assembled according to a carefully revised plan, one designed to leave no uncertainty about who stood where and why. Camilla moved into her appointed place beside Charles with the confidence of someone who believed every detail had already been settled. Her aides had delivered the instruction. Anne had received it. Nothing, they assumed, remained open to question. Then the final signal came. Anne did not step back. Instead, she moved calmly into the original position assigned before Camilla's private request had altered the order. There was no hesitation in her movement and no sign that she had forgotten what had been asked of her. She simply took her place as though the message had never existed. A senior aide tried to catch her attention. The effort was careful, almost invisible. A glance held too long. A slight movement, a quiet attempt to guide her without exposing the problem. Anne continued speaking to another member of the family. Her manner remained composed. She offered no reaction because she did not need one. That was when Camilla understood. The change in her expression was brief, but those closest to her recognized it immediately. Anne was not confused. She had not misunderstood the revised arrangement. This was deliberate. Charles noticed the misalignment moments later. His eyes moved from Camilla to Anne. then toward the uneasy members of staff who were suddenly unable to correct the situation. To challenge Anne openly would reveal that a private instruction had been issued. It would turn a silent disagreement into a visible family confrontation. And Anne knew it. Her calmness made the moment more powerful than anger ever could. There was no raised voice, no dramatic exchange, and no gesture anyone could condemn. She had created a challenge without offering Camilla a safe way to answer it. Camilla now faced an impossible choice. She could insist that Anne move and risk exposing the dispute, or remain where she was and allow the intended display of authority to collapse. She chose silence, but the arrangement no longer carried the meaning her household had planned. The other royals understood what had happened. Their attention shifted toward Charles, waiting to see whether he would defend his wife or allow his sister's resistance to stand. William reportedly stayed still, knowing that any intervention from him might look like an open declaration of loyalty. Catherine remained composed, yet her silence suggested she understood that this was about far more than positioning. The engagement continued, but palace officials were no longer focused on the schedule. The political meaning of Anne's refusal was already moving through the royal households. Some attempted to describe it as a misunderstanding. Others called it what they believed it was, a direct challenge to Camilla's influence. By the time Camilla left, the public had seen nothing more than another controlled royal appearance. Behind that calm surface, however, she had reached a firm conclusion. Anne's decision could not be allowed to disappear without consequences. The public appearance ended without a word of confrontation, but behind palace doors, the silence shattered as Camilla demanded to know whether Anne's refusal had been accidental or a deliberate warning to the entire court. Within hours, palace officials were being questioned, schedules were being reviewed, and conflicting accounts were spreading through the royal households. Camilla wanted an explanation, but the more her advisors investigated Anne's refusal, the clearer it became that no aide had made a mistake and Anne had no intention of apologizing. Camilla's private secretary demanded a full account of what had happened. Who delivered the message? What words were used? Had Anne acknowledged the revised order? Every detail was examined, because Camilla needed to know whether the humiliation had been caused by confusion, poor communication, or deliberate resistance. The answer only deepened the crisis. Staff confirmed that the instruction had been delivered clearly. Anne had listened. She had shown no uncertainty. There was almost no possibility that she had misunderstood what Camilla expected. Her silence had not been agreement. It had been a refusal carefully concealed until the moment it could no longer be reversed. Camilla reportedly viewed the incident as more than a family disagreement. To her, Anne had undermined the Queen's authority during an official engagement, and had done so in front of senior royals who understood exactly what the arrangement was supposed to communicate. But Camilla's advisors warned her against acting too quickly. Any direct punishment could make her appear threatened by Anne, a woman whose reputation had been built through decades of duty. If the conflict became public, sympathy might move toward the Princess Royal, leaving Camilla accused of using her position to silence opposition. Anne's household offered a simple defense. She had followed the previously approved arrangement. No official order had been broken. No written protocol had been ignored. That explanation infuriated Camilla because it revealed the weakness at the center of her demand. The request had not been formal. It had come privately, through staff, and depended on Anne accepting it without question. By refusing, Anne exposed it as an attempted intervention rather than an established royal rule. Charles was urged to act before the tension reached another ceremony. Advisors feared that every future seating plan, procession, and family appearance would now carry the shadow of the dispute. Yet Anne refused to negotiate through rival households. She would not trade carefully worded messages with Camilla's staff or allow courtiers to reshape her meaning. If Charles wanted an explanation, he would have to speak to her directly. That demand revived old tensions. Anne had long feared that her brother sometimes allowed emotional loyalty to influence decisions that should protect the institution. Camilla, meanwhile, believed Anne had never fully accepted her authority and worried that this public resistance could encourage others to challenge her. Officials proposed a compromise. Anne could offer a private assurance of respect without admitting wrongdoing. It would allow both sides to step back. Anne rejected it. Scripted harmony, she believed, would only bury the danger until the next confrontation. Soon, rumors spread that she might lose a visible role at an upcoming event, but removing one of the crown's most dependable figures would expose the feud more clearly than any refusal had done. With neither woman willing to retreat, the dispute reached the one person who could no longer avoid choosing between them and Charles, soon discovered that protecting Camilla might come at a devastating cost to the monarchy itself. Charles had spent years trying to secure Camilla's place beside him. But Anne represented something equally powerful: continuity, discipline, and loyalty without conditions. Now the king faced a brutal choice: defend his wife's authority, or admit that his sister had seen a danger he was unwilling to confront. When Charles finally met Anne in private, he expected the conversation to be difficult but controlled. His sister had never hidden behind polite language, yet he believed years of shared duty would allow them to settle the matter without deepening the damage. He began with the question everyone inside the palace was asking: why had she ignored Camilla's request when she knew what such a refusal could unleash? Anne's answer was immediate. Respecting the crown, she told him, was not the same as obeying every private demand made in its name. She had served the monarchy for most of her life. She understood hierarchy better than almost anyone. But she could also recognize when household influence was beginning to replace clear and transparent royal procedure. Charles attempted to describe the incident as a misunderstanding over positioning. Anne refused to let him reduce it to that. The conflict, she insisted, had begun before the engagement and reached far beyond one place in a procession. Then the jewels entered the conversation. Charles had hoped the dispute over access, inheritance, and control could be settled quietly by advisors. Anne forced him to face it directly. Objects connected to their mother, she argued, should not become instruments in a campaign for status. Their meaning could not be rewritten simply to strengthen the image of the new court. Charles defended Camilla with growing emotion. She had endured years of hostility, judgment, and rejection. Now that she stood beside him as queen, he believed she deserved the dignity and authority attached to that position. Anne did not deny Camilla's suffering. But dignity, she warned, could not be created by forcing other members of the family to visibly submit. True authority did not need to be demonstrated through altered schedules, restricted jewels, or private instructions delivered by staff. The argument became more personal. Anne reminded Charles that she had stood beside him through scandal, criticism, broken relationships, and periods when the monarchy itself seemed close to fracture. Her loyalty had never depended on praise or privilege. Punishing her now would look like an attack on one of the crown's most dependable servants simply because she had defended a boundary others were afraid to mention. Charles understood the danger. Yet he also knew that refusing to defend Camilla could create a painful rupture inside his marriage and weaken her confidence in the role he had spent years preparing her to hold. He proposed that both women step back. Anne refused. Stepping back without addressing the cause would only delay the next confrontation. The monarchy, she warned, became most vulnerable when personal desire was disguised as institutional necessity. Charles ended the meeting without demanding an apology. To Camilla's advisors, that silence looked like victory for Anne. But Camilla was not prepared to confront her directly again. Instead, her household turned toward the next major royal occasion, where rank would no longer depend on private messages. Charles may have avoided making a public choice, but the palace machinery was already preparing the next confrontation, and this time, Camilla's authority would be written directly into the official order. The next response did not arrive as a punishment. It came disguised as planning. Anne's role was reduced, her access was narrowed, and a new ceremonial order placed Camilla beyond challenge, but palace officials soon realized that isolating the Princess Royal could expose an even more dangerous division. Preparations were already underway for a major state occasion, one that would bring the senior royal family together before the public. It was exactly the kind of event where unity mattered most, and exactly the kind of stage where even the smallest change could carry enormous meaning. This time, Camilla's household left nothing open to interpretation. A new official plan was produced. Her place beside Charles was clearly protected, while Anne was moved farther from the center and given a less visible role. Unlike the earlier private request, the arrangement was documented. Every position had been approved. Every movement had been written down. Resistance would now look like a direct breach of protocol. Anne's aides immediately understood what had happened. The change was presented as routine planning, but its purpose seemed obvious. The palace had taken a private dispute and turned Camilla's preference into an official order. Anne refused to complain publicly. She knew exactly how such a protest would be described. Critics would accuse her of jealousy, wounded pride, or bitterness over rank. After decades of service, she was not prepared to let anyone reduce her principles to a personal struggle for attention. But others inside the family began asking questions. Why was one of the monarchy's most experienced working royals suddenly being pushed to the edge? William reportedly became concerned that the palace was creating a dangerous precedent. If private tension could be transformed into formal protocol, then any future disagreement might be settled by rewriting the order around whoever held the greatest influence. Catherine understood another part of Anne's fear. Royal women could not be valued only by their closeness to the king. Service, sacrifice, and public duty had to matter. Otherwise, rank would become a weapon used to silence anyone who challenged the inner court. Camilla believed the new plan would finally remove uncertainty. There would be no private message for Anne to ignore, no informal request to question. Her authority would be protected by the official arrangement itself. Charles approved the plan, but his unease reportedly deepened. He could see the emotional damage spreading through the family, yet changing the order again would appear to weaken Camilla after Anne's earlier refusal. For a time, Anne considered withdrawing from the event completely. Her absence would spare her the humiliation of participating in an arrangement designed to diminish her. But it would also create a crisis the palace could not easily explain. A senior courtier warned Charles that Anne's withdrawal would be seen as a declaration of war. Meanwhile, royal observers had already begun noticing unusual changes in her schedule. Neutral explanations were prepared, but conflicting briefings only increased suspicion. In the end, Anne chose to attend, not because she accepted what had been done, and not because the pressure had broken her. She attended because abandoning duty would allow a private feud to overshadow the crown she had served for decades. Yet her decision left one question hanging over the palace. Would Anne obey the new order completely, or had she found a way to resist without breaking a single written rule? When the day of the ceremony arrived, Anne appeared ready to obey every written instruction, but one unexpected decision transformed her apparent surrender into an even more powerful act of defiance. Anne followed the official order. She stood where she had been placed, made no complaint, and gave Camilla no opening for confrontation. Yet moments later, one quiet gesture revealed that Anne had never surrendered, and the reaction from the family made the palace's hidden divisions impossible to ignore. Anne arrived exactly when expected and followed every instruction written into the revised plan. She took the less prominent position without hesitation, offered no protest, and gave palace officials nothing they could describe as defiance. Those who had prepared for another confrontation were caught off guard. Camilla, watching Anne obey the order so precisely, began to believe the struggle had finally ended. For a brief moment, it appeared that the palace had succeeded. The hierarchy was clear. Camilla stood at the center beside Charles, while Anne remained where the official arrangement had placed her. No rules had been broken. No awkward intervention was needed. Then came the moment of acknowledgement. Anne was given the opportunity to recognize Camilla publicly. She offered the exact courtesy required by rank, formal, controlled, and impossible to criticize. Yet there was no warmth in it, no personal reassurance, and no sign that the private wounds had healed. Anne had respected the office without surrendering her judgment. What followed changed the meaning of the entire ceremony. Rather than seeking the attention of those nearest the king, Anne turned toward junior working royals and long-serving members of staff who had been placed at the edges. She spoke to them with the same direct respect she had always shown to people who carried responsibility without demanding recognition. The gesture was quiet, but its message was powerful. Anne was drawing attention away from position and back toward service. She was reminding everyone that loyalty to the monarchy was not measured only by closeness to the sovereign. It was measured by years of work, discipline, and sacrifice. After the formal proceedings, William moved toward Anne. The exchange had not been written into the official order, yet it carried unmistakable weight. Catherine followed, reinforcing the impression that Anne remained emotionally central to the family even after being moved away from its ceremonial center. Charles noticed. The plan intended to reduce Anne's influence had instead exposed its strength. Her position on paper had changed, but the respect around her had not. Camilla understood the danger immediately. Authority could be written into schedules and protected by protocol, but personal loyalty could not be commanded. Palace aides attempted to discourage speculation, yet the contrast was already clear. The official hierarchy pointed toward Camilla, while the family's emotional allegiance appeared to gather around Anne. Anne said nothing about the ignored request, the restricted jewels, or the pressure placed upon her. Silence served her better than accusation. It allowed others to reach their own conclusions. Charles quietly ordered a review of ceremonial decision-making, concerned that private preferences had been allowed to resemble official authority. Anne's original refusal was no longer seen merely as disobedience. Some inside the palace began to view it as a warning that had prevented an even deeper crisis. But the greatest revelation had not yet emerged. Just as the palace believed the crisis had begun to settle, an old document connected to Queen Elizabeth surfaced, one that explained why Anne had been so certain she could not afford to obey Camilla's request. The final revelation did not come from Anne or Camilla. It came from the past. Among private royal papers was a warning attributed to Queen Elizabeth, an instruction about jewels, authority, and family loyalty that transformed Anne's refusal from personal defiance into something far more consequential. The document was not a public declaration. It was a private memorandum concerning the stewardship of historic jewels passed through generations of the royal family. Its message was simple but powerful. These pieces were not to become symbols of personal ownership. They carried the memory of the monarchy and were meant to serve the institution as a whole. Anne had reportedly known about the late Queen's intentions long before the conflict began. That knowledge explained why she had resisted every attempt to tighten private control over the collection. To her, the issue had never been about who wore a particular brooch or tiara. It was about protecting a principle her mother believed was essential to the crown. The wording did not name Camilla or condemn any future queen. Yet it warned custodians against using inherited treasures to establish dominance within the family. Royal history, it suggested, could not be reshaped into a personal badge of victory. Charles was shaken. The warning echoed almost every argument Anne had made during their private confrontation. She had spoken about duty, collective ownership, and the danger of disguising personal wishes as institutional necessity. Now those concerns appeared to carry the authority of their mother. Camilla felt unfairly judged by instructions written before the full circumstances of her queenship were known. From her perspective, she had been trying to strengthen the dignity of the new reign, not seize family property. Yet the document placed new limits around her household's influence. Anne did not celebrate. She refused to use the memorandum to humiliate Camilla or claim that she had won. That restraint revealed the truth behind her defiance. She had not been trying to defeat the Queen. She had been protecting a boundary she believed kept the monarchy from becoming trapped by private ambition. Charles ordered a clearer separation between institutional jewels, personal inheritance, and household requests. Ceremonial decisions were placed under stricter review so private tensions could no longer be quietly turned into official precedents. Anne and Camilla continued to work together, but the trust between them had been permanently damaged. The family now understood that Anne's power did not come from title alone. It came from her willingness to endure isolation rather than abandon principle. The palace remained stunned. Because her refusal had exposed a deeper weakness, royal authority becomes fragile when respect is demanded instead of earned. Anne may have protected the institution, but the cost was a lasting distance within her own family, and the unresolved question of whether Camilla would accept those limits or search for another way to prove that the Queen could not be ignored. And although the palace publicly returned to order, those closest to the crown knew the conflict was not truly over. Because in the royal family, silence rarely means peace. Sometimes, it only means the next confrontation has already begun.